Good evening and welcome everyone to the UK Leadership on Climate webinar. I'm Christina Talaco, the chair of C4C, and I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where I live and work, paying my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. This is the fourth webinar that we're hosting with the UK Conservatives since we've launched our series in June with former Prime Minister David Cameron, followed by the chair of the UK Climate Change Committee, Lord Dibben. And last month, we had former Prime Minister Theresa May in conversation with our New South Wales Premier, Gladys Berejiklian. The reason we've been working closely with the UK Conservatives is because they've been championing a strong environment agenda for a very long time, a legacy left by Margaret Thatcher, who has included climate change on the UK's mainstream political map. She understood the political importance of the environment in a globalizing world, and she was the first major politician to hold out the prospect of international climate legislation. And the timing was also important at home for the UK because the Greens looked dangerous after securing 15% of the UK vote in the European elections only months before. So her environmental legacy continued long after she retired, and our UK guest speaker tonight is testament to that. We have the privilege to be hosting the Righteous Honourable Kwasi Kwarteng, Minister for Business, Energy and Clean Growth. And joining the Minister, we have the pleasure of having the Member for Wentworth, Dave Sharma. Kwasi and Dave will be discussing the UK's history in climate and energy, opportunities for Australia and for the UK for a clean recovery post-COVID, including the role of technology, green finance. They'll be talking about COP26 and much more. We'll also run a Q&A, so please type your questions on the Q&A function on your screen. And I'll get the ball rolling. I'll be asking a question to the Minister. Kwasi, good morning. Thank you so much for joining. Very well. It's evening here. Yeah, so.
Well, it's in the morning here. It's a very dark morning here in London. It's a bit cloudy. And I'm in my office, my departmental office on Victoria Street, which is just between the Houses of Parliament and Victoria's Tube Station for people who've been to London.
Wonderful. We're very grateful that you made time this morning. I know it's quite early there, so thanks for waking up for us.
Yeah, it's about 8:30 in the morning. So I think we're 12 hours behind.
Yes.
12 hours ahead. 12 hours behind.
Correct. Kwasi, we had a discussion before, you and I was just intrigued that you're considered the rising star of the right of the British Conservative Party. I've been reading a lot about you.
No, that's something from about a few years ago. I mean, I've been in Parliament for 10 years now, so I'm someone who's been around for quite a bit.
Correct. But you're also a very big advocate for the environment and for human rights. And here in Australia, really, if we describe someone as an environmentalist and human rights advocate, we would automatically associate that person with the left of politics. So I'll start by asking you, can you tell us how in the UK these are viewed as conservative values and how the UK managed to achieve this bipartisanship on climate?
I think you mentioned, I think your introductory remarks were very salient because you mentioned the fact that Margaret Thatcher was really ahead of the curve on this. I mean, she was talking about climate change in the late 80s. And I noticed that you had Lord Dibben address you recently. And he's someone who was a minister in Margaret Thatcher's government. And so really for 30 years now, the Conservative Party in Britain has been very much at the forefront of concern about the environment. And people always say that actually, if you're conserving, I mean, if you're a Conservative Party, what could be more important to conserve than the environment? And so a lot of the Conservative values, traditional values, people call them individual responsibility, sense of family, sense of nation as well. A lot of those values really chime very closely, I think, with a desire to conserve the planet, to conserve your local neighborhoods, to pass down a cleaner, greener country to one's children. These are all things that sit very naturally, I think, with Conservative values. And I think that the Conservative Party in Britain has been very strong in promoting that message. So David Cameron, he was the Prime Minister when I first became an MP, a backbencher. He was always very keen to stress the green credentials. Now, not all the Conservatives in the Parliament were necessarily fully behind him on that, but there was a broad consensus, even in 2010. And I think now in 2020, this is much more mainstream. So 2019 is the last thing I'll say. 2019 was my, I think, 5th general election as a candidate. And that was the first time for me that people would raise green issues on the doorstep. And so all our main parties, the 3 major parties, are now fully on board in terms of climate change, in terms of reducing carbon emissions. And it's something which there's a surprising degree of consensus now.
Well, that's a great achievement. And on that point, I'll introduce you to Dave now, because you haven't met.
Hi, Dave.
Welcome, Dave. Pleasure to have you here with us. Dave is actually sitting at Parliament at the moment, isn't it?
Good.
Yeah. So, Dave.
Well, our Parliament isn't sitting; it's sitting later today. I think in a few hours I'll probably move over there.
Right.
No, we're sitting as we speak, but I'm hopeful that there are no divisions whilst we're having this conversation.
Okay, yeah, that's always the hazard of parliamentary life.
So, Dave, based on what we've heard from Kwasi just now, do you think that Australia could possibly ever achieve a similar result as the UK in terms of bipartisanship when it comes to climate? Do you believe that these recent events that we had with the droughts and the bushfire season, was there any shift amongst the centre and the centre-right politicians that you've noticed?
Look, I'm an optimist here, Christina. I mean, I've only been in the Parliament for a little over a year, but obviously Australian politics for the previous decade at least has been bedeviled by division over this issue and political division over this issue. But my sense is now there is a growing bipartisanship or just consensus around this issue. I think there's still a legitimate, disagreements over the best way to get to the end point, but I think we're all now largely agreed on the end point that we are transitioning to a lower carbon economy, a lower emissions future. On the whole, that is a good thing, but managing the structural adjustments and the sort of the transition issues that come with that, people are going to have different points of view about that. But I think the point Kwasi made, I think, which is a very good one, which sometimes gets lost here in political debate. I mean, fundamentally, as a conservative political movement, you're concerned about legacy and you're concerned about passing on. You see yourself as a trustee for future generations, and you want to pass on that world, your society, your economy, your institutions, your decision making, your form of government, but also importantly, your natural environment in as good or better a state as what you inherited to the next generation. And I think that's why, I mean, protection of the environment, protection of our climate, protection of the way of life that comes with it should be as much a property of the centre right in politics as it is of the centre left. And in many ways, I think the centre right has better answers about how to manage this transition than the centre left does.
That's right. I think what Dave says is absolutely right. I mean, what was striking to me in the last general election we had in the UK was the fact that the Labour Party was saying that we weren't going fast enough in terms of decarbonisation. But their policy was extraordinary. I mean, we've got lots of offshore wind farms, and their view was that they were going to nationalise these offshore wind farms. I mean, this to me was extraordinary because one of the great successes of it is that we've attracted private capital. And there's no way that a government on its own is going to be able to spend its way to the future that environmentalists want to see. You've got to bring on the private sector in order to deliver those outcomes. And it's a collaboration in a way. Government sets the rules, but it's the private capital. It's private capital that will be spent. And I think the socialists who believe that government can basically spend itself to find a utopia, I think they've got this completely wrong.
Correct. And going into discussion about COVID, and which was a huge disruption for all countries, and of course for the UK as much as other European countries in a way. I know you mentioned a couple of months ago in the Climate Action Week that 2020 has seen countries across the globe take extraordinary measures to combat COVID. And you have talked a lot about this opportunity to build back better. So how's the UK balancing on one side that need to boost the economy, creating jobs and growth, and on the other side that need to reduce emissions, build resilience, and also protect the environment, given COVID?
That's a great question. It's a very broad question as well. I mean, just to wind back, let's turn the clock back to 2008 when we had the financial crisis. And yes, we did have a recovery of sorts after that. But I think the feeling now was that we really missed an opportunity in terms of driving down carbon emissions and dealing with this environmental issue. And the view very much from the Prime Minister, our Prime Minister Boris Johnson, down all through the government, was that at this time, at this really important, a terrible crisis in many ways, we weren't going to miss that opportunity. We wanted any recovery to be based on an environmentally sustainable approach. So we talked about the green recovery and we talked about green jobs. And more specifically, what does that mean? That means that we want to use the opportunity to get people to upgrade energy efficiency in their homes. I'm sure many of you have been to the UK, but in the UK, we've got very old houses, very old housing stock. We want to improve the energy efficiency. So we've got a Green Homes grant that will help people do that. We wanted to increase our commitment, as the Prime Minister mentioned, to renewable energy. And again, as I was saying earlier, that's a really good, a good way of attracting private capital to invest in green energy. And that's something that's been successful in the UK. So we were very conscious as a government that any kind of recovery had to be sustainable and had to promote and drive this green agenda. And I think it's resonating. People are talking about it. People are signing up to the Green Homes grant to upgrade their homes in terms of energy efficiency. And what the green economy represents is a huge opportunity to create new jobs and have new skills. So just to leave you with one statistic, we've got 460,000 jobs in the UK today that are linked to the green economy in some way, in terms of renewable production, the supply chains, and skills, construction skills. We've got 460,000 jobs today. And in 2030, which is less than 10 years away, we want that figure to go up to 2 million. So that's a fourfold increase. And that's something that we feel is very achievable and extremely important.
Yeah. Dave, what do you think? Do you think we're doing enough here in Australia to build back better for that sustainable recovery post-COVID? The initiatives from the government, do you think they're enough, or there's a lot more that we can do?
Look, I think, this is an area where it's never set and forget. There's always more you can be doing. You always need to be iterating and adjusting your policy. But look, I think there was a big set of announcements in the budget that we just handed down the week before last for things like, more funding for the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, which has done a great job in basically making solar and wind commercial on their own terms now, and is now shifting its investment portfolio to new technologies like hydrogen, like batteries, like industrial processes, where there are more gains that need to be made to move us towards a lower carbon future. I think that's been we're investing more in a hydrogen strategy, which hydrogen has the potential to be not only an energy store, but a transport fuel, and potentially for a country like Australia, an energy export. It could play a role in industrial processes, which are currently quite heavy emitters of carbon, particularly the manufacture of steel. I think these are all areas where we're going to need to do more in the years ahead. But I think like in a lot of countries, COVID-19 has provided a bit of a pause and a reset, and countries are looking at how they do build back. And undoubtedly, Australia's economic future is going to be lower emissions, high skill, high knowledge based industries, which is what we want our future to look like. It's not going to be a reversion to our industrial structure of the 60s and 70s.
Yeah,
I think that's great. I think Dave makes a great point. I mean, and I'm noticing some of the chat that the observation that in Australia there's been a huge in the past emphasis on fossil fuels and coal and all that sort of thing, but one can make the transition. I mean, I just want to say that. And, you look at the country, the history of Britain. I mean, Britain's industrial history was based on coal. I mean, it was for many, many decades a leading coal producer. If you think back even just to the 80s, it's not that long ago, but the coal miners' strike was a huge deal in the United Kingdom. I mean, the economy was totally powered by coal, but we made a conscious decision to move away from coal. And even in the last 8 years since I've been in Parliament, I think 40% of our power generation in 2012, even then, was coal-based, and now it's 2%. So you can really make a huge shift over time. And I think that's something to go for. And also people get new skills, and it's not going to go overnight. The coal industry won't disappear overnight, but I think we can shift the direction. And I'm sure in 20 years' time, if not less, sooner, Australia will be less dependent on fossil fuels.
So during that phase out of coal, which you've done so well, Kwasi, I think now it's only 2%, is it, that of the energy?
2% of our power generation is and it'll come off the grid in 2024, and for less than 4 years' time, we won't be using any coal to power electricity.
How did you manage to keep the lights on, the electricity cost at a certain affordability during that time of phasing out?
There was a substitution. So I think we sort of disincentivized coal in terms of carbon pricing. But at the same time, there was, we had gas, which is still a big part of that equation. But also we encouraged renewables through what we call the CFD, the contracts for difference, through auctions. We managed to attract private capital that essentially competed to produce renewable energy, in this case, offshore wind. And the prices, I spoke about 2012. Since 2012, the prices have come tumbling down for the amount, the electricity produced by offshore wind, and it's been a huge success. And today, the UK has something like 35% of the global capacity in offshore wind, and it's been a great British success story, and we're very proud of it.
Can you tell us a bit more about the floating wind and how the UK intends to become the leader or the European leader on that front?
So floating wind is another stage, is the next stage, because the offshore wind that we have is fixed. If you, as I've done, go in a helicopter and go around these offshore wind farms, they're mainly in the North Sea, and they are fixed turbines with monopiles that are stuck in the ground. Now, the concept of floating offshore is that they won't be fixed in the ground, but they'll be floating in the sea, and they'll be able to generate electricity power from floating platform. This is quite early technology, early stage, but I think the Prime Minister mentioned that we have an ambition to reach 1 gigawatt of capacity from floating offshore wind by 2030. And again, I think that's something that we're going to try and encourage through the auction process, the CFD round, as we call it.
That's great. Dave, what do you think would be the answer to our energy generation to become totally renewable by a certain year, say 2050? Do you think it will be hydrogen? And in that case, it looks like we have to probably invest a lot more to make hydrogen, green hydrogen affordable to. And there's other nations like Saudi Arabia who are injecting so much more than us. So do you think we're going to beat are they going to beat us on the mark, or are we going to be able to become, the leaders in hydrogen?
I think it's probably, it would be risky to kind of bet all your, political capital or money, if you like, behind any particular technology. I think we need to be betting on a few, and that's part of the government strategy. It's we're encouraging a portfolio of potentially different assets. I mean, I think in terms of energy generation, though, Australia has quite a good story to tell, and particularly over the last 2 years. I mean, we've had 6.3 gigawatts of renewable energy come onto the grid last year, 6.3 gigawatts thereabouts the year before. And we're now one of only a few countries in the world that's got 1 kilowatt per capita of renewable energy generation, and 40% of that has really just been in the past 2 years. Now, the challenge, as with this, and particularly with with solar, perhaps a little more so than wind, is the intermittent nature of it there. And we're addressing that through things like pumped hydro projects. Tasmania is a huge pumped hydro reservoir, and we need to find a way to connect that better to the main Australian grid, which we're doing. But I think battery storage has got a long way to go. I mean, we've seen huge gains in solar in the last few years in terms of the technology and the cost per unit, if you like. And I think battery storage, there is actually a lot of gains still to be made in that technology. And I suspect battery storage is going to get there quicker for the world than hydrogen, but hydrogen longer term, and particularly as a transport fuel, is going to be a more promising technology. I mean, it's hard to see aviation running off batteries at the moment, just the way the aviation sector works. But hydrogen, if we can manage it, is potentially a fuel there. So I think, there'll be different solutions for different problems, but I think it's all about, heading in the right direction, keeping a multiple number of technologies in play, and helping to incentivize their deployment and the R&D that comes with that.
And Dave, what do you think about in the interim, as baseload, using gas?
Yeah, look, I think that's a realistic alternative for Australia. I mean, as we put more renewables in the grid, we need to find a way to balance out the intermittency. Hydro can play a part, pumped hydro, hydro storage, but peaking gas is going to be critical here. I mean, and gas is still, I know it's not zero emissions, but it's significantly lower emissions, 50% or more, depending on how you calculate it, than existing coal. And I think until at least 2030 for Australia, not beyond then, but until 2030, gas is going to play that role as a transition fuel. It still means we're moving in the right direction, but I think it's essential if we want to keep putting more renewables into the grid, and we do, and we don't have a big base load like nuclear in Australia, then I think we need to look at gas to help manage the intermittency that comes with that.
Yeah, and Kwasi, you mentioned that gas came to the rescue for a while in the UK as well. When you
it's
more coal, it's still there.
It's still important. Sorry.
No, go on.
Gas, I think, is a transition. I mean, gas isn't. We're not going to suddenly turn off gas, and gas has got a vital role to play, I think, in a transition to a cleaner, greener future, if that's what you want to call it. I mean, I think in terms of reducing carbon emissions, it's not perfect, but it's a stage better, cleaner than burning coal. And that's something that we understand and we see. But at the same time, we want to move away from gas as well, ultimately. And the renewables is a discussion as to solar. We still have a nuclear power, which people have different views on, but I think we in the UK feel that that's got to be part of the mix. And as I always say, I mean, there's no silver bullet. I think that as an energy minister, someone looking at the diversity of energy sources, you've got to be very flexible and not too doctrinaire about following any particular technology. I happen to think hydrogen potentially has a big part to play, but again, we're in the early stages of that. And we've got to be nimble-minded. We can't just simply, bet out everything on one outcome. We've got to look at a diverse range of technologies, and that's the best approach, I think. Yeah.
Just want to ask a question on green finance to you, because you mentioned that the UK green debt in the next years is a no-brainer, and you're pushing for the Prime Minister to issue green bonds next year for environmentally friendly spending. So how far is the UK, for example, from passing any bill that seeks pension funds to take climate into account, for example, or the net zero pledge? And how do you see that will spur the market demand for green bonds, for example?
I think the market, just to pick up your last point first, I think the market demand for green bonds is sovereign green bonds we're talking about in sterling. Is huge. I mean, I speak to friends of mine, people I know in the City of London in finance. I started my career in finance, issuing bonds, funnily enough. I mean, they weren't green in those days, but that was my job. And speaking to old colleagues, there's anecdotally a huge appetite for sovereign bonds. And you look around the countries that have issued them. I mean, I think the Germans just issued, 12 billion euros worth this year, in different maturities, different tranches. And there was a huge appetite for this paper, as the market calls it. And I think that's something which we should be capitalizing on. And that's something that I've been talking to with the Prime Minister and and the Chancellor of the Exchequer and other members of the government.
Right. Dave, what are your thoughts on green bonds?
I think they have got a future. And look, I think it's this sort of stuff that is driving the transition. I mean, it's consumer preferences, it's capital markets,
Sure.
it's behaviour of investors, and we need to be encouraging that. I mean, there's an Australian group, Pollination, which has just signed I think a $4 billion deal with HSBC exactly to help harness this appetite for this sort of investment. And we see it from, pension funds obviously have an interest in this, but even high net worth individuals increasingly want to have investment with a social impact or ethical investing, and it's tapping that demand for this sort of thing. So I think it's a market that will only grow over time, because people want to feel that they're putting their money in not only a project that delivers a return, but that also does something good for the environment. So I think there's a long way to go on these things.
And what Dave says is absolutely right. I mean, I just want to chip in here, because we're seeing this in the UK. I mean, the investor appetite, it's not just the government that's driving this push to greener finance. Our investors in the City of London and internationally are very conscious of these issues. I mean, I was just reading in the paper, there's a Danish offshore wind company called Ørsted. And the market capitalization, so the market value, the value of all its shares, for the first time was higher than BP. And BP has been around for a very, very long time. It's a great company, but clearly investors are, in many instances, looking to renewable technology to invest in that, and that has attracting a premium. And if you listen to BP, if you listen to Shell, and you listen to their rhetoric, they are increasingly driving a net zero future, not only because they believe in it, but they realize that their investors need to hear that story. They need to know that these companies will have a future, and they won't simply be just trapped in the kind of world of the fossil fuel company of the 20th century. I think there's an increasing realization among investors that world may well be a thing of the past.
Yeah, I think with the increase in borrowers and issuers considering ESG at the moment and the impact of their actions, this green finance revolution will definitely be gaining a lot more traction and will be here to stay for sure. Now, I wanted to open questions to the audience, but just before that, a question on COP26, because the UK will be hosting that, and hopefully I'll be there, and lots of Australians. But Kwasi, you called for countries to come to COP26 with a lot more ambitious NDCs. For those who don't know, that this is the nationally determined contributions, and to set their net zero targets. You've been calling for that. How important do you think it is for countries to legislate a target, even when they're saying they can't get there, they don't need a target? And what are your expectations of COP26?
So in terms of the target, I could only talk about our experience here in the UK. And as many people will know, we set a target, we legislated for net zero only, I think it was last June. So it's barely more than a year. And as an energy minister, I can assure you that has completely framed the nature of our discourse. It's given us a strategic focus on a date. And it means that all of government is pulling together to try and meet that legally binding target. So I think targets, legally set targets, are incredibly helpful. Now, I wouldn't prescribe it to everyone. I don't know the circumstances in every country, but I think I would encourage people to look at it, because it's a very good way of focusing people's minds, of giving a strategic objective. And we live in democratic countries, and Dave will know this as well. I mean, it's very tempting when you've got an election every 3 or 4 or 5 years, simply to think in that time frame. But what this net zero target has done through legislation is it's given us a much more strategic, longer term focus. And I think that's in democracies, that actually can be quite helpful. One thing we haven't mentioned in terms of the trend and where this thing is going, the most astonishing thing for me this year was the fact that Xi Jinping, President Xi, announced that China wants to have a net zero target for 2060. Now, obviously, we would wish that that would be sooner, but for China to say that they want to get involved in net zero, and they really want to leave a cleaner, greener China for their children and following generations, that's a huge step. And I think that just shows the fact that China has come out with this, for them, ambitious target, shows the extent to which this isn't just a fad. This is something which is gaining wider consensus across the world, across different political traditions and parties. So it's a big event when China says that they want to have a net zero economy by 2060.
Indeed. Dave, do you have any thoughts on targets?
Look, my thought is, look, this has had a long and fraught history in Australia, and I think the political context is a little different to the UK. I'm more interested in getting there. I think sometimes the debate in Australia fixates too much on particular targets. I think we're all committed. Anyone who's signed Paris, and that includes Australia, is committed to getting to net zero. The world getting to net zero in the second half of this century, which means we've all got to do our bit to do it. I think it's as important to make sure, though, that the interim targets we're setting on the way, they're actually targets that are realistic and that are met, because the process up until now has been filled with high ambitions that ultimately unrealised or succumb to a change of government. And I think I'm in Australia, and with our particular context, I'm interested in making sure that whatever we do is durable, and durable not only in a sort of an economic sense, but a political sense, that it can survive political changes in fortune and indeed changes of government, because this is too important an issue to be left to those sorts of political vicissitudes. So we'll come to Glasgow whenever it's rescheduled. We'll certainly be looking, I expect, to match or exceed the level of ambition shown by other countries, and I know the UK intends to set a pretty high bar there, and that's as it should be. I mean, it's only with the world working together that we will reach where we need to be. And I think I was also struck by President Xi Jinping's speech that China for the first time committing to net zero by 2060, and their emissions, which people would be aware have continued to grow. They're still due to peak in 2030. I mean, I wish they could bring that date back a little sooner as well, and agree to peaking their emissions before 2030 and getting their emissions to net zero more like 2050. But look, it's in the right direction, and we should continue to encourage that.
Thank you very much.
Definitely.
Well, I'll open to the audience now, but Kwasi, we've received a question from a lady from the UK, Patrice Marriott, and it's not really a question, but it's more like she wants your comment on something, and it's got to do with the TSC, which had focused panels on the decarbonization and green economy. She's saying that panelists said that the impact of climate change was being priced into the financial services sector going forward. Prudential deposit takers identified the need to get funds out into the economy at pace and without conditionality. She then asks, this is a narrative which is being developed in the UK by the UK about itself and the future. TSC and my member for Kensington, Felicity Buchan, have done a great job in championing it. Would you care to comment?
Look, I think that's encouraging. I mean, I'm not so sure that it's fully priced. I mean, one could, I'm not a huge fan of the market efficiency hypothesis, but I do think that, investors are looking more at climate change issues, at carbon emissions, at sustainability generally, and that's a good thing. And I think Felicity Buchan is doing a really good job. I mean, this is her first term. She just got elected, I think, in December, and she's doing a very good job on this, and she's very plugged into the financial community.
Okay, she might like that answer. So I'll just open to the Q&A. There's a lot of questions coming here. I'll ask an interesting one just to, well, it's a question from Victor Purton. The question is for Kwasi. Minister, what makes you an optimist?
Well, lots of things. I mean, you look at where we've come from on this issue. I'm specifically talking about climate change. I mean, in the UK, and many of you know the UK, coal was a huge part of industrial revolution, okay? A huge part of empire, which is where I'm from. My family are from West Africa. And you just study the history of Britain and you look at how coal was central to it in the last 300 years, let's say. And now, as an energy minister, I can say that it is responsible for only 2% of electricity generation. That is an extraordinary phenomenon. I mean, in real terms, even in the 1950s, we were mining in Britain 200 million tons a year of coal. 200 million tons. That's like almost a million tons a working day. Again, today, these numbers have completely collapsed. And a lot of it was to do with industrial transition, but most of it, I would say, and the reason why we're not involved in it is through an effort of will to say that we need to go into the renewables. And that's happened in the last 10 years. And the last thing I'd say is that, yes, we've massively reduced our dependence on coal, but at the same time, we've incredibly increased our dependence and our footprint, if you like, in renewable energy. Offshore wind, when I was elected in 2010, people were talking about offshore wind and other people thought they were crazy. They thought this is silly. But actually offshore wind is now responsible for nearly 30% and on some days, nearly 40% of electricity generation in the UK. 15 years ago, this just didn't exist. So I look at the changes that we've seen and the progress we've made, and that gives me cause for optimism. And very lastly, I'd say this: there's this story that somehow economic development cannot go along with green policies. That somehow that if you're environmentally friendly, that means you're somehow against, you know, the processes of the market, of capitalism, of wealth creation. Nothing could be further from the truth. If you look at the history of the UK in the last 30 years, we've managed to reduce emissions by 45%. And at the same time, grown the economy by 75%, by 3/4. So it's absolutely the case that you can have both. You can have economic generation, economic wealth generation, economic wealth creation, as well as have a much greener, more sustainable approach to the environment and the economy. So that the two aren't in mutual antagonism. They're things that can work together to create a much more sustainable economy and a better future for our kids.
Great comments, thank you. And Kwasi, we've got Sam Hall watching the webinar from the UK. He's the head of the Conservative Environment Network in the UK, who's working really closely to us here in C4C. So he's asking you a question: what are the main reasons for the strong consensus in favor of climate action in the UK amongst the UK Conservatives, and which arguments for decarbonization have been the most significant for you personally?
So that's a good question. I mean, I think you have to sort of go back into the recent history of the party, and we talked about this, I think, at the beginning of the call. 2008 was when the Climate Change Act was passed in the UK, which essentially committed the UK to 80% reduction in emissions. I wasn't in Parliament at the time. It was 2 years before I was elected. But even then, there was a cross-party consensus. And I think David Cameron deserves quite a bit of credit for driving the green agenda, because he realized that we had to have, you know, conservatism for the 21st century. And he saw that very early on. And from a kind of electoral coalition point of view, it was no secret that younger voters are much more energized by these kinds of issues. They're much more passionately engaged with the fight against climate change, with reducing carbon emissions. And any political party, competitive political party, had to be conscious of that. And the Conservative Party is often described as the most successful political party in the world. And so as a competitive centre-right party, I think the climate issue, the environmental issue, was something which we did very well to adopt as our own. And as a consequence of that, I think in many ways, other parties have been following us. And I think that generally it makes us a very strong, gives us a strong appeal to younger people who perhaps wouldn't necessarily be inclined to vote Conservative. So it not only makes sense from a macro point of view in terms of combating climate change and reducing emissions and all of that, it also makes a lot of sense from a political point of view. And for me, the biggest argument was the Conservative argument. what I call the conservative argument, i.e., what are you conserving? What is the Conservative Party about? And yes, we talk about traditional values, we talk about family, we talk about pride in country, we talk about respect for law and order, we talk about individual liberty, we talk about all those things. But I think that talking about preserving a planet for future generations in the way that Dave described earlier is absolutely part of that. In a way, it's even more fundamental than some of the principles that we associate with conservatism.
Thank you. Dave, there's two questions for you. One is from Greg Story. Is the Morrison government supporting a faster pumped hydro scheme other than Snowy 2.0? And the other question is to do with energy efficiency. The retrofitting policy that the minister, that Kwasi just described for the UK would be very helpful in Australia, where our built environment is not energy efficient, and therefore it would be helpful in reducing household energy. Is the Morrison government considering such a policy? So pump hydro and energy efficiency.
Yeah, look, absolutely, and they're very good questions. Look, on pumped hydro, look, Snowy 2.0 is obviously the biggest scheme, but there's a number of other ones, and harnessing the pumped hydro storage potential of Tasmania is a part of that. There's a number of projects already complete in Tasmania and more underway. And the so-called Battery the Nation project, the Marinus Interconnector, is basically about allowing Tasmania to plug into the main electricity grid in Australia, which covers nearly all of Eastern Australia, and playing that role. There are also feasibility studies underway for other piped hydro projects underway in mainland Australia. Our topography and geology is such that the Snowy scheme is probably the biggest bang for the buck that's out there, though. On energy efficiency and built standards, I mean, absolutely. I think sometimes in this debate, people become quite fixated on the electricity market, but electricity, of course, is between a quarter and a third of our total carbon emissions, and we've made great strides in energy, but in other sectors which are big emitters, agriculture, industrial processes, transport, and then the built environment, we haven't made nearly as many gains. And I think increasingly that's where we'll find the low-hanging fruit. Just running air conditioners less in building, retrofitting buildings so that they're more climate sensitive and more climate friendly. There is a focus on that, and particularly the work that ARENA and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation are doing. But I think there is more that we can be doing there. Absolutely. I did, if I could take the liberty, Christina, just wanting to jump back on I think the first question Kwasi answered about optimism and the reason for optimism. And I think we do have cause to be optimistic. And I think when you're in the midst of these things, it's natural and understandable, and in many respects, it's helpful to be quite worried about the future and to be quite anxious about the future and worry about how we get there. But the history of humanity, at least since the Enlightenment, but certainly even before then, has been one of a remarkably resilient, resourceful, and adaptable species. I mean, it was in the late 18th century that Thomas Malthus warned that the world would soon run out of food, and the populations couldn't keep growing because they would be quickly limited by famine and disease. Well, the population has grown orders of magnitude since that time because we've learned how to do more with less, get more outputs out of smaller inputs. When nuclear weapons came onto the scene at the end of the Second World War, people were worried that a nuclear exchange would end the world. That was the existential panic and threat of the 1960s, the 1970s, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that is still a worry. We still need to be very concerned about that. But I think we've stopped the spread and proliferation of nuclear weapons by and large. We've constructed a whole lot of protocols around their storage and use and deployment such that it's almost unthinkable now that a country would seek to use nuclear weapons. Doesn't mean we can discount it, but I think we've come a long way there. And then in the 90s, the ozone layer, the depletion of the ozone layer, which was, the environmental issue du jour of that era. Countries came together, the Montreal Protocol was signed, we phased out some of those most ozone damaging gases and goods, we changed our industrial processes, we changed consumer behaviour, and we got there. Now, I think this is a difficult problem, no doubt about it, but we've shown ourselves in the past able to address global problems, notwithstanding the fact that we're governed nationally, not globally, and able to cooperate across different political systems, levels of economic development, cultures, languages, value systems, and everything else to get this done. So that's not an argument for complacency, absolutely not. But I think it is an argument sometimes to put aside a bit of the fatalism and inject this with a bit of optimism, because that's what we need to get some of these things done.
Well, thanks, Dave.
That's excellent. No, I think that's right. I think that's a good answer.
Kwasi, there's a question here from Ivan Quayle asking you, is the UK pursuing fracking?
Well, the short answer to that, as of today, is no. We had a moratorium, which was announced, I think, it was before the election, but it was at the end of last year, so it would have been about October. The reason why we announced the moratorium was that the fracking that had happened in Lancashire was producing huge disruption. So it was something like 2.9 on the Richter scale. And we thought that this was too much. So we imposed a moratorium. And so we're going to look at the evidence. And if we can do it, if the evidence changes, then we would reconsider that. But at the moment, given the data that we had, we thought it would be too disruptive. And I think actually the fracking debate is very much kind of, 10 years ago. I mean, the debate, it's technology from the noughties, the early part of the century. I think with the increasing reliance on renewables and the success we've had with renewables, I don't think that in the UK, we really need to go down the fracking route.
Thank you. And now a question for both of you from Michael Frangus. How do we reconcile the need for an interventionist approach, given the rate of exchange required to transition to a decarbonized economy far exceeds the capacity of the market approach?
It's a good question. I mean, Dave, do you want to answer that first, or shall I just jump in?
I think you're a minister, Kwasi. You
okay. Well, look, my view is, so I'll start with an anecdote. David Cameron used to say there was no quicker way of making a liberal into a conservative than making them a Home Office minister, Justice Minister. That was his. That's what he said. And I would say that, I mean, I started my career very much on the pro-market, almost on the sort of laissez-faire. I loved Margaret Thatcher. I was a Thatcherite. I was very enthused by that. And I say there's no quicker way of turning a Thatcherite into someone who does believe in the power of government than making them an energy minister. And I'll explain. Energy policy and getting good energy outcomes will always be a function of regulation, which comes from government, and the private sector. There's no way that you're going to have an energy market that is purely reliant on market forces, because you need a government to set rules, and that's the same for lots of different markets. But just as wrong is the idea that the government, by taxing and spending on its own, without any reference to the private sector, can get to where we want to get to. There's no way that any government in the world has the knowledge, the foresight, the planning ability, the means, the resources to get to net zero just through government spending. So it's always going to be a dialogue, a combination, a cooperation between the private sector and the public sector. And the way I see it in terms of the energy market is that, energy markets are complicated things. You're dealing with lots of different resources. You're dealing with lots of different participants, and you need strong regulation. Doesn't mean that it has to be a lot of regulation, but you do need that kind of regulatory framework. And the only people who can provide that are the government. Now, once the government sets the regulatory framework, then you can have a degree of competition, you can have a degree of private sector engagement. And that's absolutely essential, because without private sector deploying investment, we wouldn't get anywhere. Take offshore wind, for example. The success of that has been the government setting the rules, setting the auction process, but it was private companies that bid for those contracts and has largely delivered in terms of the capital expenditure on these projects. So it's a dialogue, a collaboration between the private sector and the public sector.
Dave, do you agree with the minister?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I mean, I think this is an area economic life that there's always going to have a high level of government involvement and regulation. So the government is always going to be setting the rules and the frameworks, and that's important. But I think it always needs to be doing so in a way that's sort of working with the grain of technology, working with the grain of financial markets, capital markets, consumer behaviour. And I think when you get that balance right, that's important. I mean, I often think the analogy here of the transition from our vehicle fleet from what was a sort of a heavy gas guzzling post-war fleet to a much leaner fleet doesn't mean the fleet is still not clean, but that was really done by a product of fuel emission standards, which were government mandated and introduced, but then also a price shock in the Arab oil shocks, the Arab oil embargo of the 70s, which sent the price of gas through the roof. And that was, it was those two things. It was government policy on the one hand, but also, consumer preference, consumer behavior, market signals on the other that helped, basically, helped, smaller, by and large Japanese-made vehicles enter the market and become mainstream. And this is an area where, again, I think it'll be partly government policy and standard setting that will play a role, and then partly consumer behaviour, capital behaviour, market signals.
Thanks, Dave.
I think that's right.
Dave, there's a question for you on electric vehicles from Felix Taif. He's asking, when does Australia expect to release any electric vehicle policy, given it was previously announced by Minister Price in the mid-20 to be announced in 2020. The UK has already made plans for that, and they brought it forward.
Look, I believe it's this year. I've discussed this with the Energy Minister. I agree with you, absolutely. We need it sooner rather than later. I think there are huge, the level of uptake of electric vehicles in Australia is still, it's still way too low in my opinion. It's low by world standards. And I think there are things we can do to help accelerate that uptake. And I think, my impression is that consumers are very keen on this technology. They just want to be, they want to be reassured about the availability of charging and basic infrastructure and servicing. And there needs to be a sort of a critical mass in the marketplace to allow, a proper dealer network, a proper servicing network, a proper charging network. And that's a role where government can lead and play a role. I think transport fleets is another huge potential for electric vehicles in Australia, and that will probably see the quickest transition or quickest uptake of these things. And once we've got transport fleets on board, well, that will help create the infrastructure for wider consumer uptake of it. So it's been promised to me this year. I expect it will be delivered this year, and I'm looking forward to it. I think it's needed.
Right.
And a question for both of you on solar, I guess. According to a recent Economist article, that 70% of all the world's solar panels and solar batteries are made in China. How do you plan to reduce Australia's and Britain's dependence on Chinese technologies? This is by Dilip Varma.
I'll just say very briefly, I think Dave mentioned battery storage earlier in his remarks, and I think that's absolutely crucial. I think in terms of solar as well, we need to get more efficient installations, more efficient processes. And I don't think, I haven't looked at our supply chain as closely, but I don't think we're as dependent on Chinese technology or Chinese infrastructure in this space. I think there are lots of other sources of solar technology. And my understanding is that we want to create a diversity of supply, and we're already doing that.
Yeah, look, I'd just add there, it's an interesting figure, 70%. So 70% of the world's solar photovoltaic cells now use technology that was developed in the University of New South Wales. And I think that's probably a more important figure, because producing solar cells en masse, it's a commodified mass production exercise.
Sure.
There's not a lot of intellectual property in there. And the stuff that we need to be concerned about is the intellectual property. I think countries like Britain and Australia, if we, still have the intellectual property, we can always get the manufacturing to get them done. We shouldn't.
That's right.
We shouldn't be too hesitant about buying things from countries that are able to produce them en masse and cheaply, because that's what comparative advantage is all about. That's what trade is all about. We need to make sure we're not too vulnerable to any particular supplier, but I think that's particularly when we're talking about critical commodities, critical pieces of intellectual property, where we wouldn't want to have dependency on any single country for supply chain disruption reasons. But I think solar cells, I'm pretty relaxed about us, if that figure is correct, buying a large number of them from China.
Okay, I think we have time only for one more question, and it's from Maria Atkinson. Dave, having heard the minister speak on attracting green capital to fund economic recoveries and ensuring a green recovery, will you support the climate change bill by Zali?
Look, I've looked at the bill. I believe Zali's editing it, or has a different version of it. I'll always assess every bill on its merits and when it comes before me, and I'll see what contribution it can make. My initial reaction to the bill was it was creating parallel government structures that already exist. It was creating things like, a role for the Office of the Chief Scientist, a role for the Climate Change Authority, and these sorts of bodies that we've already got in Australia. But look, I'm always open to new ideas and new inputs, and I'll take a look at it when there's a revised draft.
Thank you. And Kwasi, one last question for you. When do you think you might be coming to Australia? I know,
very soon. I mean,
given the borders.
Post the COVID crisis. I noticed someone in the chat, why are they laughing? I'm laughing because I always get these questions. You always get these questions. Will you support such and such a bill? And it's a very, very difficult question as a parliamentarian to answer. So I kind of chuckled because I'm very, very familiar with that question. Will you? And it could be any bill. I mean, I know that I don't know anything about this legislation, but the form of that question, will you support so and so's bill? It's something that I found familiar, and it sort of rose a wry chuckle in.
I think they've answered quite well.
Okay, good.
So we're running out of time, but I'm really thrilled that we have another member of Parliament with us tonight on the webinar, and I'd like to invite her now to do a vote of thanks, and that's Fiona Martin, which is a fairly new member of Parliament, and she's the federal member for Reid. So Minister, introducing Fiona to you. She knows Dave, of course, and she's here to give the vote of thanks for tonight.
Hi, can you hear me there?
Yes, indeed.
Oh, good. Hi. Well, wonderful to tune in, and what an excellent, what an informative and inspiring conversation that you have here this evening. And I like the optimism, and I also liked the endorsement of Margaret Thatcher. That was lovely. Well, it's clear that investing in sustainable technologies is essential as the global energy sector looks to transition to a low emissions model. And it's also very clear that climate change policy is one of the most important factors in our economic recovery from coronavirus, from the economic impact of COVID. Before entering Parliament, I was a psychologist, a practicing psychologist, and science informed my practice. I would be called a scientist practitioner. And as a parliamentarian, since I've been elected, I've been firm in saying that scientific evidence must drive our policies, and that includes climate change policy as well. And so we need to take that direction, I think, from the experts. We've seen commitments in the Morrison government's 2020 budget to a greener recovery, with recycling and also clean energy listed as a key priority in modern manufacturing plan, and also new funding as part of the energy plan to support low emissions and renewable technologies. But I think more needs to be done, and I think that this conversation this evening has been valuable in doing that. So I'd like to thank the UK Minister for Business, Energy and Clean Growth, Kwasi Kwarteng, and the member for Wentworth, my friend Dave Sharma, for sharing their insights and aspirations at this virtual event this evening. Thank you very much. And obviously climate change requires both local and global solutions, which is why bilateral dialogues like this, like tonight's forum, is so very important. So for this reason, I would also like to extend my thanks to Christina Talaco, for Chairperson of Coalition for Conservation, for making tonight's event possible. Thanks, Christina.
Thank you so much, Fiona, and thanks for coming tonight. And that really brings us to the end, unfortunately, of this wonderful evening webinar with Kwasi Kwarteng and Dave Sharma.
Thank you.
And I hope to see you all on the 18th November. We're hosting our Minister for Energy and Emissions Reductions, Angus Taylor. But keep the date in the diary, 18th November, and thank you again to all of you who attended tonight. And I feel quite invigorated with everything that I heard from Dave and from Kwasi. So take care, have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, Christina.
Bye.